Is there need for immediate responses on the panel? I do not see any excited hands being raised. So we're moving straight into the discussion rounds. And I believe the microphones are going around. So I have a question at the back. And yeah, Sebastian. Please, go ahead. Yeah, and then the next one. Mm-hmm. Sebastian, go ahead. Okay.
Okay. Well, it's more like a question / remark to Rüdiger Bachmann. Well, first, thank you very much for this nice and clarifying presentation. I think parts of what you said is very convincing and probably was very convincing to many of us here. When you talked about new empirics, new data, I think this is something we all are excited about, or at least I would say 90% in this room. Where I found your plea less convincing was the element about DSGE, how you put it in. And especially, I mean, you try to separate between DSGE philosophy and DSGE models, but I think parts of what you mentioned in philosophy actually pins us down on certain models. Because if you talk about transparency and modularity, that means you should start changing small elements. And this is something I think many of us here are unhappy about, because there's a fundamental difference between what post-Keynesians believe the economy works and what, well, new Keynesians believe. I think many here would say instability is endogenous to the economic system, and the DSGE models which we have, they basically have exogenous shocks, and then they're amplified or not, and the economy reacts to that. So this is very important, because if you believe that the economy works fundamentally differently, you cannot work with this modularity. Because, I mean, if you believe that a cucumber is very different from a human body, you wouldn't try a new drug on a cucumber, yeah? So if you think these models are fundamentally flawed and fundamentally not showing what's going on in the economy, it doesn't help you that you start, well, changing one block or the other. That's more like a remark, but maybe you want to comment on it later.
So there was another question at the back that I originally thought.
Thank you. Thank you for the talks. I have two remarks. One on for Stephanie Seguino. I think what you presented is really, really important to include. I think in France, it makes me think of France. We don't have racial statistics. They say it's discriminatory. I think they're just too afraid of the results that it would give. But I would have a comment on what you say about productivity gains, especially for children who have brain damage and so on. I think there is a limit to economicism somehow, and that we shouldn't cross this one. And this was done, I think, here. The issue is not whether or not there will be a productivity loss for later. It's just an issue of fundamental value of equality, justice, and whatever the result on productivity, we don't look at that. We shouldn't look at that, or it shouldn't be an argument for action. Well, that's my point of view. And I have a comment to Rüdiger Bachmann, or a reaction, as you were appealing to young students. Well, you said you could only fail. I would agree with that. In my case, I mean. Well, just to go a bit further, you said you have new data, new empirics, new modeling, new topics, new everything, but the only thing that is missing is new theory, and it's just not. It's not just a funny attack. You mentioned environmental economics as a new topic. Well, first, it's not that new. People have argued for 30 years now that we shouldn't be taking action now because the optimal time for transition is later, because we'll have better technologies. Where this is a theoretical flow. There is no optimal timing for the transition. And in the models, there is substitutability between capital and energy. This is just nonsense. Okay. And for example, you add, these guys, they add a damage function to aggregate production function, and we know here that this doesn't make sense. So there is a fundamental problem of theory.
All right.
That's why I'm not convinced.
Thanks a lot. I have 4 more people on my list already, so please keep your interventions brief. Next is Hans-Jörg.
Hans-Jörg here. Also question to Mr. Bachmann. The first question is, when we look at Thomas Kuhn in the 1960s, he spoke about different paradigms. And he spoke about physics, not economics. So my question is, do you think it also makes sense to have different paradigms in economics, or is economics, so to say, qualitatively has economics overcome, so to say, what physics can do? So or do you have the different paradigms within your different approaches? My second question is, listening to you, to all these important approaches, a lot of empirics, it seems that you are convinced the more we know, the better we know empirics, then we are on the safe side. My question is, will big data always help? I'm just thinking about these risk models in financial markets. Before the financial crisis, a lot of data was used, but this data led us in completely wrong direction. How do you handle this problem?
Thank you. Michaelis?
I have 2 brief questions for Professor Bachmann. I think you ignore some issues that are very important. The conference is about the 10th year anniversary of the crisis. So why not a single DSG macroeconomist predicted the crisis, while at the same time there were many other macroeconomists who did, and they were very precise about the mechanism that led to the crisis. So this is something that we should talk about. The second question, implicitly you said that the benefit of DSG models is that they provide micro foundations. But at the same time, it seems that in all these new DSG models, all the action takes place because of the frictions that you introduced, which are not deep variables, as people refer to the preferences on in micro theory. So, isn't this a little bit contradictory? Thank you.
Can I start answering, because otherwise I'll forget?
I have 2 more and I have the questions written down. I will. Tom Bailey?
Tom Pally. My question, too, is to Professor Bachmann. And let me try and, I think what it does is it joins what Hans-Jörg has said and what Sebastian has said. There's a great paper I love from a long time ago by Kydland and Prescott on theory before measurement. That all the data in the world doesn't help you if you don't have a theory in advance in which to frame and place that data. And I think this kind of gets to where there is some pushback against this defense of DSGE. My understanding of it is that it comes out of Arrow-Dubrew theory, to which then some sort of imperfections are imposed. That's the modularity. You get frictions, market imperfections, different forms of competition. But at the end of the day, there is a question of meta-theory. And I think that's what we're trying to put to you, that Arrow-Dubrew does not provide a good meta-theory, even when it's filled in with all these imperfections. And that there is and this is where you will get some resentment and pushback from us, there is a complete unwillingness on the part of mainstream economics to go to the question of meta-theory. And of course, that traces all the way back. There was a session in this conference, a very good session, on the Cambridge Capital controversies. That is an example of meta-theory being ignored. That's where the rubber really hit the road on that particular question, on welfare economics, on the framing of utility theory, and so on. Fundamental uncertainty. These are all things that the DSG model can't handle. And that is why I do believe it's a degenerate paradigm in the sense that it constantly runs into problems and therefore needs another friction to be added. This last great recession, we've seen the ZLB suddenly appear as the latest new friction. But it's therefore a degenerate paradigm, and worse than that, it's an intolerant paradigm, because it will not make space for people who have different views about the meta-theory that is guiding economics.
Thank you. Özlem? And this is the last one.
Okay, let's start with Stephanie. Thank you very much. I think your work is a great example of how we can have a unified theory. You're doing a lot in synthesizing Kaleckian and feminist economics. So my question to you is, because since you have mentioned ecological economics at your closing, what would be the entry point of synthesizing ecological, Keynesian and feminist economics, particularly in reference to some of the work I read in feminist economics, which likes always contrasting the impact of the investment, public investment in physical infrastructure, construction, which is a male sector, versus social infrastructure. That doesn't lend itself that readily to a great unified ecological feminist post-Keynesian analysis, but where do you see the entry point? Engelbert, short question will require a long answer. You did say in your talk that new Keynesians are reinventing the post-Keynesian wheels. So can you give a bit more examples on that? Because to follow Rüdiger, I'm afraid you're not going to escape my question, so you will have to write down another list of questions now to your already long list. Why do what you call modern macro people never cite feminist economists, post-Keynesian economists? Do you agree that you are actually reinventing some of the wheels that feminists or post-Keynesians have already invented? And then I'm going to be a bit more specific. You're developing the supply side of the model, borrowing some insights from feminist economics, let's say in the economics of the family. The word gender doesn't exist, feminist doesn't exist. In 20 pages of references, there's no reference to feminist economics journals in the Handbook of Macroeconomics chapter on the macroeconomics of the family. When you think of developing the supply side, I think you're doing very little on the demand side, in particular when it comes to the firm behavior. You proudly said what is being done about the firm behavior, but I hear very little about an investment behavioral function that lends itself to distinguishing the effect of demand versus profitability on investment. There's very little that is visible about the impact of financialization on the non-financial firm when I look at what you call modern macro. So I obviously see a very clear weakness on the demand side. And this is very important, of course, when you discuss the impact of fiscal policy without properly developing the linkage between public versus private investment. We're not going to get a full-scale, useful policy-making, policy analysis macro from that line of research at the moment.
Thanks a lot for the numerous questions. I'm now going to move back to the panel. So, Stephanie, do you maybe want to start?
Thanks for those questions. I'll start with Özlem's question first. I think that that's work to be done in terms of what's the entry point for ecological economics. Some of it's been done by Bina Agarwal for developing countries. I think a lot, it has certainly relevance for agriculturally based economies, for example, but I think we're sort of in the beginning of trying to find those linkages, and so I think that's work to be done. With regard to the comment with regard to France and its statistics, well, it's an interesting issue, and I will leave that at that, and I think your point is well taken that maybe some fear of the results. But I want to push back on your comment that somehow you're losing your identity as an economist if I talk to you about brain neuroscience. I think one of the the great weaknesses of economics as a discipline is the failure to read widely in sociology, in psychology, and in other domains. Economics is fundamentally about human beings. Macroeconomic economists, I think, too often lose their connection with real people's lives, which is actually the goal of what we are working towards, which is how to improve those. But if you don't understand people's lives on the ground, and you don't understand what influences human behavior and human cognitive abilities, then you're weakened as a macroeconomist. It is interesting to me that we are willing to think about productivity of machines, of all of the various things in the world, but not the productivity of human beings. And maybe this is gendered, because a child who has cognitive abilities because of trauma and suffers throughout their life is largely cared for by the mother and not men. So maybe that's why it's more of interest, and women have pointed this out before men have. But actually, part of where this comes from for me is also seeing the social costs in our schools, the enormous cost of dealing with kids with trauma in our schools. But so I think that, you know, this notion that we should just look at the short-run effects of economic shocks like austerity and so forth and not look at the long-run impacts is simply flawed. But I also want to talk about something else just very briefly. This work that has been done on brain neuroscience, I've referred to the impact on children, but 30%, a huge portion of people in our societies have experienced trauma. And that is debilitating in terms of their productivity. It is debilitating in terms of their mental health, which has huge economic costs. We could bring those costs down if we were to attenuate the economic instability that people experience. But there's a piece of this I want to see if I could explain very briefly to you that I think is also really readily apparent in the politics that we're facing right now. So in the brain, there are three systems in the brain stem, which is the automatic functions of the brain, your blood pressure, your heartbeat, and so forth. There is the middle portion of your brain called the limbic system, which is your fight, flight, or freeze mechanism. And there is the prefrontal cortex, which is the newest architecture. It's the architecture you all are using right now. It is analytical, it can think in the long term, and it's wise, and so forth. What happens when people are traumatized, including by economic crisis, is that the prefrontal cortex shuts down because the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism lights up and it dominates the rest of the brain. And that is precisely what politicians have been using as a way to get political support in recent years, is triggering fears about immigrants, triggering fears about emasculation of men, and so on and so forth. And so, truthfully, we actually can't have healthy societies that are well-functioning if we don't address the problem of economic shocks that, yes, do affect the brain and affect our psychology, and yes, it is a relevant economic topic.
Thank you.
I want to actually start by agreeing with you. I found this,
Awesome.
these brain image studies fascinating. I would have to see the exact empirical strategy to really establish whether they really established causality. That's crucial here, obviously. But if that's the case, I mean, this is an old question, obviously, the welfare cost of business cycles, and this would add to that in a very powerful way. So I like that a lot. Okay, so now let's. A lot of questions. So the first, modularity, I guess that is indeed a within paradigm thing, a within paradigm bonus. If you just don't believe the whole thing at all, I agree, then you're not going to be happy with modularity. There's really nothing else I can say. But I want to say that it's modular enough to get a lot of these insights again, and not just in small steps. I think the small steps is important. That's just scientific method, I think. And, you know, sometimes this may not be fast enough for policymakers, and I completely understand that. But at the end of the day, scientific, at least regular scientific science, that's how it proceeds, doing small steps. And I would defend that as a good way to proceed. But, you know, eventually, of course, you want to have multiple new models, of course, and you want to understand the interaction. So, but anyway, it's a within paradigm thing. New models, new theory, for me it's the same thing. So I don't quite know what the critique was. Again, if you're not happy, if you just believe the way works, the world works in a very different way, then of course, I can't make you happy. I will say I am proud of these new data developments, but I would agree with some of the. I'm not advocating a blind or stupid empiricism. Of course not. Of course not. There has to be theories that you look that give you lenses through which to look at the data, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't look at the data, okay? And these data are just important, but only microfounded models, and I think the ABM folks in the crowd would actually agree with me. Only microfounded models. We can then debate about the microfoundation. That's a different story. They would probably disagree with what is a microfoundation or a good microfoundation, but the fact that we have micro agents in these models that we can then discipline with microdata is not something that, that's shared by some outside the mainstream, for example, the ABM, and I would defend this just because we are never going to tell apart how the world works just with a bunch of time series that fluctuate around. We just don't have enough data. And of course, we can't run natural experiments with macro data. Typically, sometimes they're given to us, as in the case of reunification, but typically we just can't put whole economies in a laboratory, so it has to be the micro data. I just don't see any other way. And for that, you need microfounded models. Again, that's not to mean microfounded models in the way the mainstream has it. This means any microfounded model, okay? Meta theory, yeah, I agree. I'm not very interested in meta theory. It bores me, okay? To claim that these new models that we see, for example, a hunk model, this is the state-of-the-art neo-Keynesian model with nominal frictions and incomplete financial markets, look still like Arrow-Debreu models. It's semantics in my view. They look very different from Arrow-Debreu models. But, I'm not going to convince you, and you're not going to convince me that I think of course, they're historically at some point coming from Arrow-Debreu models, but, they're just very, very different. They function very different. They have very different policy implications. They're just in any meaningful aspect, they are not Arrow-Debreu models. Fundamental uncertainty cannot be handled in a DSGE model. It's just plain wrong. It has been done. I invite you to read these papers. Again, I don't know what else to say. Kuhn, Kuhn, in physics, Kuhn's description was really, if I remember correctly, Kuhn's description about physics was really about physics having reached the stage of one paradigm science at any given time, and then there are these paradigmatic shifts, these scientific revolutions, but at any given point in time, you had essentially one paradigm, right? That's sort of Kuhn's description. Is economics in that phase? Should it be in this phase? In a sense, no. And I said this at the beginning. I'm happy that there are ABM approaches, there are complex systems approaches, but at the end of the day, we all will go apart afterwards and do our own thing. And hopefully there's more dialogues like this that at some point we can kind of convince each other which elements are good and should be kept. But again, then I go back to the microdata. I think that's the future. I don't know how else we could possibly distinguish some of these approaches if we don't tell them apart through implications for microdata. The predictions of the crisis, I don't know how many people predicted this crisis, and in particular, how many people have had an accurate prediction of many crises, not just once. It's not that easy since there are not that many crises. Again, if modern macroeconomics is actually right, then you shouldn't be able to predict crises. Now, you don't have to believe this, but that's basically a direct implication of modern macroeconomics. So I don't know about the prediction of a crisis, how important that is. The data that these banks looked at, I don't know. I certainly didn't have these data at my disposal. I don't know whether that would have helped us, but it's not modern. I don't know, but I would claim that no academic, non-bank related economist had really access to these books. Maybe regulators had. I certainly didn't, so I couldn't possibly know what these data would have shown had I looked at them. Then the question, the micro foundations, yeah, that's exactly the point. we are trying to get better microfoundations, but that doesn't mean we should have no microfoundations. We're trying to get better microfoundations, more serious microfoundation that's really, not just taken for analytical tractability, although there's value in analytical tractability. I don't want to dismiss this, but at the end of the day, that to me is not an overarching concern. This was much more concern in times of limited computational resources, for example, which we still have to a certain extent, but they're not as binding anymore. So now I think it's the time to learn from these micro data sets and actually have better microfoundations. I will say also, though, conceptually, microfoundation is really a relative concept. There is no such thing as the microfoundation or a good microfoundation. It depends on the research question. So what is a good microfoundation is always there's some judgment work involved and some rhetoric, some convincing of other fellow economists that you have a good microfoundation in a sense of structurally stable. The question is structurally stable for what? What is the research question? So I don't think we should view the notion of microfoundation as an absolute. For some questions, a Calvo ferry is a wonderful microfoundation. For some other questions, it's a terrible microfoundation. Okay, and sort of theoretically telling these pieces apart where it is, where it's not, and at the same time learning from microdata whether pricing is actually state dependent or time dependent, as the Calvo ferry would suggest. We can actually learn again from the microdata. The last thing I think was citations. One general comment on that and one specific comment. Why these people that wrote the handbook article didn't cite you, I have no idea. You have to ask them. Okay, there's just nothing. Okay, I'm just saying. These particular people, you have to ask them. I cannot speak for them. In general, I would actually agree with you. If there's a problem, if people don't cite relevant work, relevant ideas, they should. I fully agree with you. There's not much else I can say. That's just basic, I think, not just scientific politeness, but scientific ethics. What else can I say? And then your investment
and the main side of the DSG models underdeveloped. What do you think?
What does that mean?
Okay, you don't distinguish between the demand versus profit effect on investment. You don't look at the impact of financialization of the non-financial corporation. You don't appropriately look at the impact of fiscal policy on private investment of the firms. So the demand side, I think, is very much underdeveloped, at least compared to the supply side of the DSG models.
I again would disagree. This is true for certain DSG models. I would disagree in terms of the whole paradigm. I don't know why you say that there's no demand side effect of investment. Investment has, in any model that I know, has this double-sided function, which is basically it's part of the firm. In that sense, it's part of the supply side. And it's also, affecting aggregate demand. I don't like these notions of supply and demand anyway, at least in DSG models. In general equilibrium models, supply and demand make little sense, actually. So this is a bit sort of inherited vocabulary from partial equilibrium times, which, makes in partial equilibrium perfect sense. In DSG models, it makes little sense. So I don't know why we don't have this. We have... there's elaborate investment theories, and the question is more generally, how do these models look like that they can make aggregate demand effects matter? And I gave you, there's a slide on this, I gave you 3-4 bullet points where people are actually now studying, models where effective aggregate demand, including private and public investment, matters a lot. So I don't know why you say this. It's just not description of the state of the art.
Okay, I've been asked to briefly elaborate on my claim that the new Keynesians are reinventing various post-Keynesian wheels. That's, among other things, the endogenous money creation that various central banks by now essentially have argued, where Kumhoff has incorporated into a DSG model. These are typically areas where post-Keynesians who have long argued that credit is creating deposits is not acknowledged. It's in the area of financial instability, where those parts of the mainstream that do use financial instability models tend to acknowledge Minsky, but essentially are not citing any of the follow-up works. It's in the area of hysteresis, where post-Keynesians, including several people in this room, have for a long time argued that demand shocks do have supply-side effects, whether it's in terms of endogenous wage norms and unemployment, or whether it's in terms of the productivity effects that demand shocks have. Again, that's an area where in excellent empirical work, there's essentially no recognition of the previous work that's there. Of course, the post-Keynesian tradition has long argued that, in particular in recessions, you do need fiscal policy and discretionary fiscal policy. That is, again, something that new Keynesians have reinvented. They've done quite extensive work on identifying the working of asymmetric multipliers in the upswings or downswing, or sometimes when the zero lower bound is binding. In the post-Keynesian tradition, that's a fairly standard argument, and there's an extensive literature on there. We could also extend that to the Nairo theory, but having an eye on dinner, I'll stop there. However, I have to make one brief comment on Rüdiger, which is about how we think about crises, to what extent we can predict them, to what extent we think about them as exogenous or endogenous. Because you had this line in there that if modern macroeconomics is right, you actually strictly can't predict crises. And I think that's a point that crystallizes the dissatisfaction in this room with mainstream economics. Because that makes sense if you have in mind the DSG models that has sort of a happy and in particular a stable equilibrium at its core. In that circumstances, you have to think of the crisis as being caused by an exogenous shock, and the exogenous shock almost by design is unpredictable, because otherwise it wouldn't be exogenous. If, as many of the people in this room think of crisis as endogenous, there's a built-in mechanism that will give rise to them, and the implication of that is, of course, that they are predictable, because there's a pattern in the economy that can be predicted. And that is why a lot of people in the post-Keynesian, in particular the Minskian and the stock-flow consistent modeling tradition, have highlighted long before the crisis that those sharp increases in household debt, that imbalances between sectoral debt positions are a danger for the sustainability of the growth path that we are on. And in that sense, the post-Keynesians claim that some of us have indeed predicted key mechanism of the crisis. A bit closer to home, and by home I mean the central banks, on a bit more the mainstream side, there's various studies, part by the IMF. I particularly like the Barrel et al. Paper, I think 2012, that essentially is looking at standard economic variables, financial variables that central banks, you would have thought, are routinely monitoring in the course of their economic stability analysis, like credit growth, like house price growth, like current account imbalances, and to what extent they predict financial crisis or more general recessions. And you can do that including, they do it including, excluding the 2008 crisis. And they consistently find that those indicators have fairly high predictive value in terms of these crises. Sort of, for policy purposes, it's non-trivial how you fine-tune them, but sort of the proposition of a big part of modern mainstream economics of thinking of crisis as exogenous shock, and the flip side of that in central banks, that the central banks essentially couldn't do anything because they couldn't know about the crisis. From our point of view, that's plain wrong. If you do the ex-post forecast for various crises, it's not that difficult between credit growth, house price growth, to find variables that predict recessions.
And I think there's complete consensus. I mean, you know the work of Schulerich and all these mainstream people. But that's not what I meant. Of course, and I will fully grant that mainstream macro before the crisis was blind to that, or not susceptible to that, and maybe they should have listened. I meant predictability in a stricter sense. Give me a month of when this thing is going to happen. I don't think post-Keynesian theory can do that. Otherwise, there should be a lot of rich people in this room, because you could have traded against this. But I fully agree that, ex post from macro historical data, there is, in that sense, predictability, and that debt aggregates and credit growth play a role. Yeah, I don't think we need to. That's not a matter of debate. I think we fully agree. And all I can say is that some of the empirical work that has been done to establish that, and maybe you will tell me that this empirical work had been done before by the post-Keynesians. I would be happy to look at that. But at least the work I know that has established this over 100 years of time series has been done by prominent representative of mainstream macro, of essentially macroeconomic historians.
Okay, I will have to relegate the second round of questions to dinner for reasons of time. However, I would ask you, the panel, for a final brief comment. Yesterday's panel, Martin Hellwig said, today Deutsche Bank would need to be bailed out again because we are still not in a position where we have changed our system sufficiently. Where do you think, looking forward for macroeconomic theory, where do we need to go so that in 10 years' time we are going to be in a different place than today? And I'm going to start with you and put you right in the spot.
And I have to answer that without even a minute to think about it. I guess what we need is the short version of that is break up the big banks and establish public investment banks. The private banking sector, I think, is not fulfilling its social and economic role. It is creating additional sources of instability instead of financing socially useful investment, and thus there needs to be government facilities or alternative facilities, doesn't have to be government, to provide that service to the economy.
Thank you.
It's not my area of expertise.
Macro theory, where should we develop?
I don't know that we need to develop more macroeconomic theory in this respect. I think I completely agree with Helwig that, I don't know whether I would get that far, that there's an antitrust problem, although, again, that's something really for IO economists actually to look at. I'm not sure that we as macroeconomists have the right tools to do that, so, that's something I would think IO economists should look at. And if so, if there is an antitrust problem, then we need to have the tools. I'm not going to just say, we have to break them up without any evidence. That's what I don't like about this. We need to have a serious discussion about this and a serious investigation. But I would agree with Helwig that the equity requirements are too low, and the regulation is too soft. But we know this, and at this point, I don't think it's a matter of macroeconomic theory. It's a matter of macroeconomic policy.
Okay, thank you. Definitely.
I don't want to stand between you all and dinner, so let me just say very briefly. I think one of the things that's fascinating to me about this discussion and looking at who's represented in the room is a very narrow spectrum of global society, and very little macroeconomic theory of this kind has been developed for rich countries and really does not consider what's going on in poor countries. And I think that's a huge challenge. The other, I think, is, since the time of Alice Amsden, who has really began to rehabilitate the role of the state in economic development, I think that we have that work to do of redefining what the role of government is in terms of stimulating growth and development and in addressing the deep problem of inequality that we face. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.